Well, hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having me at Blue Leaves V Expo this year. I'm really excited to talk about net zero and how you can get started on your sustainability journey and set credible credentials as well. Just part of the agenda, I will start with why net zero is important right now and looking at the bigger picture as well, what it all means, and talk about the different terminologies, for example, carbon neutral, climate positive, net zero, and demystify some of these terms. And we look at what carbon footprint look like, what you need to be measuring, and then look at some of the solutions with you getting to net zero and some next steps you can do today to start this journey and make it hopefully as easy as possible. First of all, I thought I'd give you a little overview of who Planet Mark are. We are a sustainability certification, and we are a little bit different to a lot of certifications you might see going around. We were founded back in 2013 in partnership with the Eden Project. We were built in SMEs, but since then we grew and working with large organizations as well. And we mainly focus on the business case of sustainability and helping organizations to adopt really credible sustainability credentials. And we follow these three-step method. So firstly, we help organizations to measure and independently verify their carbon footprint and social value data. And at the same time, we're helping companies engage with their staff. So bringing their passions from outside of the workplace in and allow them to be part of the organization's journey and really play an active part in it, which gives them a greater sense of purpose as well within what they do. This really makes them kind of sticky within the company, so it reduces the staff turnover as well. And thirdly, we help the organizations to communicate their sustainability achievements in a really meaningful way that avoid greenwashing, because it's all based on independently verified data. And just wanted to show you, so we work cross-sector, and here are a few of our members. Some of you can recognize from the visitor attraction sector as well. So for example, Born Leisure with Butlins, Haven and Warner Holidays, Extreme Sports, who will be here today as well, and the Eden Project. And a little bit about the big picture things. So why net zero now? Let me just do this. Oh, sorry. So there are a few different drivers in here, which is actually quite interesting. So there's the obvious environmental and social imperative that we are in a climate crisis. So we have been calling this decade of action because we have only 10, well, actually now almost just 8 years to reduce our carbon footprint every year to keeping the temperature increase well below 2 degrees, ideally below 1.5 degrees in order to safeguard future generation. And this actually means that we have to cut our carbon emissions to reach net zero by 2050. And there are also different commercial imperatives as well that actually we know that people and companies would want to work with organizations who are adopting better practices. Large corporations are building net zero actions into their tenders and their supply chain having to set net zero targets as well. So there's a real competitive advantage for companies who are treating this as an opportunity to differentiate themselves in the market. And within the visitor sector attraction industry, there are also an increasing pressure from the stakeholders as well. So given like the investors, for example, environmental social governance, ESG will be really important for anyone looking to raise finance or buy or sell. But also particularly customers, your visitors, who especially Generation Z, who will be choosing organizations who are operating with a purpose. And there's also a lot of regulations coming through now from SECA, TCFD, all these weird and wonderful acronyms, which means companies are having to do it, therefore having to do it over a certain size. And also in the UK, we have a law binding commitment to net zero by 2050. So I thought I'd tell you a little bit about the carbon jargon thing, and hopefully we will bust the carbon jargon. So some of you would know about all the different scopes. but I thought I'd just bring everyone to one level. So let me just briefly talk you through these scopes. So this is from the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which is the most widely used framework for measuring organizations' carbon footprint. So as a minimum, companies need to require to measure Scope 1 and 2 emissions. Scope 1 is your direct fuel consumption, which you have operational control over. So that's your gas consumption of your buildings, and that's your fuel you're putting into your vehicles. Scope 2 is your electricity consumption. And then we got everything else which sits within your Scope 3 emissions. These are 15 categories. They are all indirect emissions that occur on your value chain of the reporting company, including both up and downstream emissions as well. And not all 15 Scope 3 emission categories will be relevant for all businesses. If I pick a couple of relevant ones for your sector, one is visitor attractions travel, by your guests to your sites. We have companies who measure that, which is really interesting, and that you can work out ways in order to increase your visitors to use low carbon mode of transport to visit your sites where possible. So that's very high overview of footprinting of the different scopes. And in this slide, we're looking into what do we mean by net zero carbon emissions. In order to be net zero carbon, we have to get your Scope 1 and 2 direct emissions down to zero. And this is through procurement green energy, electrifying your fleet, and looking at some serious energy efficiency measures you can take at your sites. And then Scope 3, you're going to be measuring the relevant Scope 3 categories and then getting them as close to zero as you possibly can, around 90% ideally. Then you have to then offset those remaining 10% using carbon removal offsets, which I'll touch base in the following slides as well. So that's net zero. So we also have many different phrases, climate positive, carbon negative. So I just wanted to show you what we think the two most common phrases are, and which are the two really credible approaches to tackle climate crisis. And this is carbon neutral and net zero. So carbon neutral is a framework which sits within the PAS 2060 framework, where companies must be measuring their Scope 1 and 2. They don't necessarily have to measure their Scope 3 emissions, but they're going to have carbon reduction plan in place to reduce. And once they measured and they have a plan to reduce, they can then offset carbon footprint. And if they do all of these activities, they can become carbon neutral. Net zero is how I explained in a previous slide as well, is slightly different because you have to look into your Scope 3 emissions and you have to radically reducing your emissions in there as well. But those emissions have to be offsetted through a different kind of offsetting, which is removing greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. So I just wanted to show you these two types of offsets as well. So there are the carbon avoidant offsets, which are things like wind farms, solar PV, electric cook stove, things that stop carbon from entering the atmosphere and replace carbon emitting to the atmosphere. So it's not actively removing carbon, but it's stopping carbon entering the atmosphere. And there's the carbon removal offsets, which are actively sequestering carbon from the atmosphere. So these are natural carbon sinks, for example, so peatlands, planting trees, seagrass projects, as well as technologies such as carbon capture and storage. It's a bit of a cowboy industry, unfortunately, out there with the offsetting projects. So what we always recommend in order to ensure that they would say on a tin, always recommend to use gold standard or verified carbon standards, so VCS, when you're looking into purchasing offsets. And I'm just going to show a couple of ways how organizations can measure their carbon footprint and kind of represent it and to their employees and to their stakeholders. So this is one way we summarize up an organization's carbon footprint. So this pie chart really allows us to see where companies having the most significant impact. So therefore, we can focus on activities around that area. In order to measure carbon, a lot of this data is readily available. So it sits within your finance department, and we have to take the data and we want to use these carbon conversion factors that we have in order to convert and verify your carbon footprint. We also understand that we have to engage with people in a way that who are not as carbon literature as, for example, a sustainable manager within your firm. So this kind of this type of representation can help them really wrap your head around the kind of individual impact as well, and understanding what carbon means. And just very quickly, these are the first simple steps that you can start to think about how you're going to reach net zero. So firstly, the cheapest energy we use is the energy we don't use. So energy efficiency is a really big thing. Find out ways in which you can use less energy. That's the most powerful thing you can do. Then we go to start retrofit and redesigning areas where we're emitting carbon, for example, electrifying your fleet. And 30 is to switch to renewable energy tariff, or if you're big enough, purchase PPA directly from renewable energy providers. Make sure that your energy comes from renewable sources. This is a nice and easy step for you to make. And from the supply chain perspective, you've got to be collaborating with your supply chain. So what you can do is mapping up your supply chain and find those hotspots in your supplier base. So identify your key suppliers. That could be by spend as well. That could be by emissions as well. And you've got to be working with them and support them as well, especially the smaller ones that are on the way, that are on what they can do to reduce their carbon footprint. So you need data from them. So the products you're purchasing, you should try to identify the life cycle analysis for those products as well. And that's just a great way to kind of engage with them too. And plotting your curve to net zero, I thought I'd show you a little graph which shows you the trajectory you need to go on. So I showed you the difference. So this here you can see the true zero and a net zero trajectory. So we know that in the first 5 years, you will reduce your Scope 1 and 2 emissions close to zero, and reducing your Scope 3 emissions almost to zero, so to a minimum. But we understand it's quite tricky after a level to reduce those even further. So that's when the offsets come into place. So those residual emissions will be treated with carbon removal offsets, for example. So and also, we don't say that carbon negative and climate positive and carbon neutral is a bad thing. It's not. This is a part and the way of achieving net zero as well. So it's amazing if you're already having those initiatives in place. They really are helping you towards net zero. But to become truly net zero, you will have to look at your Scope 3 emissions as well. And here I just wanted to share some amazing initiatives which are happening in the visitor attraction sector, and some of which we heard about at Green Loop conference in April as well. And we will hear some more from Catherine and Amber later on today as well. So Portaventura is aiming to minimize the environmental footprint and has already opened their first zero emission hotel in Colorado Creek. So they have announced that the entire resort is carbon neutral, making the theme park in Spain a benchmark for sustainable tourism in Europe. And in 2019, 100% of their electricity they consumed at the resort came from renewable energy sources, and they also offset 100% of their direct emissions generated, made them the first carbon neutral theme park resort. And Born Leisure is one of our members. So between 2012 and 2020, they reduced their total emissions by 43% through a number of initiatives. For example, there were central initiatives where they invested into more efficient lights, installed heat pumps technology, and changed to more efficient boilers as well, for example. But I think what I've really loved in their story is that they created green teams at each of their sites. And they are the one who were also driving these initiatives. So they were given the opportunity to form these teams. And every year, they organized engagement conferences and trainings. And each green teams from across the different brands were attending these. And they could really collaborate with each other then. And lots of initiatives and ideas came up in these conferences and trainings, which then they trialed at the different sites. And if it worked out, they were implying it into the other sites as well. So I think it's an amazing way to get your employees engaged as well. And Eden Project is they've been monitoring and reducing their carbon footprint year on year. And they extended the reporting for their full Scope 3 emissions as well. That's an amazing way to really set them up on a net zero pathway, looking at the emission in Scope 3 and starting to reduce it year on year. And in April, we also learned about Eden's geothermal energy project. They're going to be harnessing naturally occurring sustainable energy from down below the earth. So this heat pump technology will then create both heat and drive turbine to create electricity. And I also wanted to highlight Blenheim Palace as well. Again, so we learned from them in April that they are becoming carbon negative by 2025. So they had amazing initiatives of reducing their waste volumes. They also have renewable energy generation on site and invested in low zero carbon technologies as well. But what I really liked as well is that they reduced their waste by 97%. They diverted their waste from landfill. So 97% is already diverted. And for example, they use Too Good To Go to date unconsumed food as well. And what's also very exciting that they are they're working on engaging with their visitors to encourage them to arriving by a sustainable mode of transport. So that's that's an amazing initiative as well. And just finishing with this message that it's us together. We can hold the climate crisis if we all take action today.